Welcome to Around the Turn. In this series, we will look at sports car racing and its stories from the obscure to the well-known, and maybe even dig a little deeper into things you thought you had known. Today we will take a look at the Daytona prototypes, a controversial class that lasted a decade and a half. Our story begins in 2001, when the higher-ups of Grand-Am were holding meetings to discuss the future of the prototype class of the Rolex sports car series. At these meetings included Roger Edmondson, the president of Grand-Am, Bob Snodgrass, the owner of Brumos Porsche, Jim France, the CEO and founder of Grand-Am, Mark Rauffaf, the Grand-Am director of competition, and Dave Watson, the technical director of Grand American, amongst a few others. There were two main issues facing the sports racer prototype class at the time: cost and safety. Now, with cost, there was a fear of outpricing the series competitors. You always have to think about the guys who are showing up and putting on a show. Now, if we take a look at one of the top sports prototypes of the time, Ferrari 333 SP, it would set you back $900,000, and with that you would get one car, two engines, and a cache of spare parts. For example, if you went to the Indy Racing League, you could purchase a chassis for $275,000 from either G-Force or Dallara, and you could pick up an engine from Oldsmobile or Infiniti for $75,000 apiece. So you could essentially buy two cars and get two engines for only $700,000 with $200,000 to spare. Now, another issue with these cars was safety. Now, the SRP cars weren't built to take head-on collisions on a tight roval like Daytona. These cars, like the Cadillac Northstar LMP and the Riley and Scott Mark III, were built for the long, fast straightaways of Le Mans, a track that features plenty of runoff, is very long, and is wide in several areas because the track has had safety advancements throughout the years, even up to now, to keep the cars as safe as possible on the 8-mile road course. And along with that, the open cockpit nature of the cars made drivers susceptible to being hit by debris. This almost happened in the 2001 running of the Rolex 24, and on another occasion, a car spun with its bodywork being shed off and could have possibly also hit the driver in that situation. Now, with these ideas being thrown out at meetings, Mark Rauffaf, the director of competition, would sketch a design on a cocktail napkin. Now, it's believed that Dave Watson would send this sketch over to Dave Klim of Fab Car Engineering. Now, Dave Klim would come up with a render based off of this napkin concept sketch. Now, upon seeing this concept, Jim France would order two cars to be put into production immediately. This car would evolve to become the Fab Car Daytona Sports Car 03. Fabcar would work on the car throughout the fall of 2001, trading notes with Grand-Am, who was also working to finalize the rule set for the category. At Grand-Am finale weekend at Daytona International Speedway on November 1st, 2001, Grand-Am president Roger Edmondson would announce the Daytona concept car to the team owners. On January 25th, 2002, the initial specs for the new Daytona coupes were revealed. The cars would be closed cockpit with two seats symmetrical to the car's center line. They would be mid-engined and powered by Grand-Am approved non-aspirated stock block production-based engines, which would also be non-stressed when it comes to the building of the car. The cars would be flat from the front bulkhead to the rear axle center line and would go across the full width of bodywork. There would be no sprung part allowed below the reference plane, and the bodywork must be made from fiberglass, carbon fiber, or Kevlar, covering the circumference of all four tires and a valance to cover the rear of the car. The cars would be built with tube-frame chassis and would also feature mandatory carbon fiber side pod impact structures. The cars would stand at 41.5 to 43 inches tall, along with being 77 to 79 inches wide. They would have to be at least an inch and a half off the ground for ride height. They would feature a wheelbase anywhere between 108 to 110 inches. The cars would feature a spec single-element rear wing. There were no production requirements for the Daytona coupes, but all designs and plans would have to be approved by Grand-Am before production, and any major components must be approved and available to all competitors. On January 30th, the new Daytona prototype rule set would be announced. Now, the class would feature two different kinds of race cars: the Daytona prototypes themselves, then known as the Daytona coupes, and grandfathered sports racer prototype race cars. Now, the sports racer prototypes would be allowed in, but with a few enhancements. First off, any car with competition history in 2002 would be allowed to compete in the 2003 season. They would also have to conform to the same engine, weight, and tire regulations as the new Daytona coupes. The new rules were meant to keep the racing tight and action-packed as it's ever been. The lack of technology put more emphasis on driver talent. This is something that was believed to be lacking in the American Le Mans series, where you needed the top cars to compete for the wins. Tragedy would strike. While practicing at the Homestead Miami Speedway for that weekend's Nextel 250, Jeff Clinton's number 21 Lola spun in turn 1. The car would go airborne and land upside down on its roof. But in a rare accident, the roll bar would snap, killing Jeff Clinton instantly. Now this accident would lead to a few changes. The driver would be moved in and the side tubes on the car would be lowered. That way the driver would have more room for entering and exiting the vehicle. To address frontal impacts, the radiator and radiator hood would form one structure that could handle the strength of the impact. The cars would also see gearbox attenuators, just like the Indy cars, to address rear impacts. On March 12th, Pro Motor Engineering was announced to help Grand-Am with the engine approval process. The certification guidelines would be announced a month later. The first test of a brand/model engine would be for free, but any changes or upgrades would have to be resubmitted and tested for a $3,000 fee. On April 4th at Brickyard Crossing at IMS, a constructors meeting would be held for the new Daytona prototype class. At these meetings featured representatives from Carbear Racing, Crawford Composites, Crawford Race Cars, Duran Enterprises, Emco Gears, Fab Car Engineering, Ferrari and Maserati, Ford, G&W Motorsports, Peugeot, Kinney Brown Performance, Multimatic, Pankel, Riley & Scott, and X-Track. By the end of April, the first 2 engines were ready for testing. Prototype Technology Group, or PTG Racing, would submit the BMW M5 V8 engine. Total Engine Concepts, from the Modular camp, would submit a Corvette LS6 V8 engine. Only a few months later, the first Daytona prototype driver fitting would take place at Brumos Porsche, with J.C. France and Hurley Haywood getting to feel the car for the first time.
Even though this is still a cage with no bodywork, it feels like a Porsche. I've driven Porsches for 25 years. When I get into this car, the steering wheel is in the right place, the dials are in the right place, and the seat fits. So I'm very comfortable. It feels just like a Porsche. Hurley Haywood.
On July 11th, the engine rules would be updated. This graph here shows the engines that had been approved and their specs, and the specs of engines that could be submitted in the future. BMW would see their 4.9-liter V8 approved along with Porsche and a 3.6-liter V8. Meanwhile, Ford had a 5-liter engine that had been tentatively approved. Pro Motor Engineering would assume that about 6 engines would be approved by fall of 2002. Also, Toyota would reveal proposed specs for their own V8 Daytona prototype engine. Grand-Am would announce that it'd be sending 2 groups to visit the Daytona prototype builders internationally. Roger Edmondson, Mark Rauffaf, and Don Haywood would visit Italy to check in on Peugeot and Ferrari, while Dave Watson and Jim France would head to Canada to check in on the Multimatic program. When talking about Peugeot, Roger Edmondson had this to say.
Having talked with Dave and Jim since I got back, we were all impressed with the professionalism and engineering efforts behind the Peugeot and Multimatic projects. When I got to Italy, I was brought into Peugeot's engineering center where they had 25 engineers all working on different aspects and components of their car.
And also had this comment to make about Ferrari.
We had some great discussions with the folks at Ferrari. They are very interested in having a Maserati engine approved for Daytona Prototypes competition, and we had some very serious discussions about chassis options and other details.
Dave Watson would have this to say about the Multimatic upon returning from Canada.
The design of the Multimatic Ford is definitely state-of-the-art. There's more to technology than using carbon fiber. It's about how you go about designing things, and from what Jim and I were shown, the Ford Focus is very carefully engineered for maximum performance.
Then on August 28th, Emco would be the first company to have gearboxes approved for the new program, with their GA46P and 46C gearboxes being approved. They would be joined a month later by Raytech, whose 96TH pattern 96S gearboxes would also be featured in Daytona prototype competition. On September 20th, testing dates would be announced for the new Daytona prototypes. At Grand-Am finale weekend, they would have a separate testing session just for the new class, alongside the classes competing in that weekend's event. Then at Daytona on the first weekend of December, they would have a 36-hour window for new teams to test out the new parts, get the kinks worked out, and see how well the car runs in an endurance test. A month later, Peugeot would announce the price of the new P2 Daytona prototype. Earlier in the video, I brought up how new Ferrari 333 SP would send you back $900,000 for a car, 2 engines, and spare parts. You would get a car with an engine, transmission, and data acquisition components ready to race for $375,000. A few weeks later, Fab Car would test their FDS CO3 at Putnam Park. Hurley Haywood and J.C. France would run 120 miles without bodywork. in a systems check just to ensure that everything worked properly on the new car. Less than 2 weeks later, they would complete that first chassis, FDSC 03-1, which would be bought by Brumos Porsche, which would see its first official test at Daytona that week. At the Grand Am finale weekend, Haywood would become the first ever driver to complete a lap in the Daytona prototype. Then, a few weeks later, the 2003 rule set for the Rolex Grand Am Sports Car Series would be set in stone as the teams prepare to get ready for that inaugural race at Daytona. On the 4th of December, Peugeot announced that they would skip the Daytona test and instead hold one of their own at Virginia International Raceway. Then that weekend, the Daytona prototypes would test for 28 hours straight, with the Brumos Porsche car only suffering one issue, a minor oil leak that was easily fixed during the test. Segusport would find out that their Toyota-powered Daytona prototype was working flawlessly as well, but would later suffer an accident in testing. A few days later, the Corvette LS6 engine proposed by Total Engine Concepts would be approved by Grand Am for competition. A month later, the Ford 5.0 engine previously mentioned would also be officially approved. On January 5th, at what we now call the Roar Before 24, teams were testing, getting ready for the 41st running of the Rolex 24 Daytona. The fastest lap of the weekend was set by Brumos Racing with their number 58 Porsche Fab car, setting a 1:48.9 lap around the 3.5-mile road course. That time would be 1 second better than the fastest GTS car in the field, the number 40 Durhag Motorsports Corvette, which set a 1:49.5 at testing. Then, showtime, February 1st, 2003, the 41st running of the Rolex 24 Daytona. Here are all the chassis that would be eligible for SRP conversion to run in the 2003 Rolex Sports Car Series. Here are a list of approved builders and chassis manufacturers from Grand Am, and here are the engines that the teams could run in this Rolex 24. Now, after seeing all the combinations of car and engine, you would think that we would have a grand entry list for the 41st running. There would be 6 cars that would make up the Daytona prototype grid. But that's a story for a different day. First, I'd like to thank my Uncle Carl, for without his contributions and essentially bankrolling the research, I never would have been able to put this video together. I'd also thank my brother Cannon for giving me this mic to use to record said video, and Ben Schneider of The Ben Schneider Show for sending in additional dialogue. Thank you for helping me with recording this, man. You can subscribe to him here by hitting this card or by hitting the link in the description below. Now, this has been AZ Sports Car 80. I hope you guys all enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time. You all take care and drive safe. Good night.